You are listening to Democracy Now!, the exception to the rulers. I'm Amy Goodman. So we are joined on the phone right now by Lisa Calvelich, the woman who blocked a shipment of napalm during the war. The song that Pete Seeger wrote about her was actually inspired by the court transcript of her statement about why she chose to engage in that civil disobedience. She's now 78 years old and lives in California. Very briefly, your story, Lisa Calvelich, what you did during the Vietnam War.
Hello?
Hi.
Yes.
Your story, what you did during the Vietnam War.
Well, I do have to say that, it was based that I accepted after a lot of soul searching when I was in this country that everybody is responsible for what happened in their country. And as they said in the Pete Seeger song, when I first heard this in 1947 in Nuremberg, what is the town I was born and raised, and where the tribunal was, I totally rejected the idea that we are all guilty. And I felt we were betrayed by our country, by our government, and the people who were on trial, correctly because they caused all this trouble. But daily and daily, there was no other radio than those reporting, and they were talking about you German people, you're all guilty, that's mass guilt. And as I said, I rejected it. But after I came to the United States and people were asking me about it and said, what did you do when this was going on? And I said, I was a child, I was a teenager. Well, what did your father and mother do? And the people here have been totally ignorant what it means to live under a total dictatorship where the press, everything was controlled. But then I accepted the fact that, yes, we have to take responsibility watching what happens going on. And, of course, the war in Vietnam started, and I felt also betrayed after Lyndon Johnson said American boys shouldn't fight where Asian boys should fight, and young men were sent over. And I decided that I had to say something now. I couldn't be silent like my parents were, even they had anything to say under the Hitler government. And so together with 3 other women, we belong to the San Jose Peace Center, we decided to make a public protest. And at that time in the South Bay, near San Jose, it's the end of the bay, there were napalm bombs stored. They were built at United Technology in Redwood City, and every night barges brought them down to that storage area. And then when they had enough for a shipment to Vietnam, what was a tremendous number, they would be taken back to Port Chicago, what is in the North Bay, and put on warships and so on and taken to Vietnam. And so that's what we did. We went there. We were aware what's going on. We went there. We crawled through a fence and sat down in front of a forklift. We knew that we would not stop the war in Vietnam. I mean, we didn't have this illusion. But we also knew that a lot of people didn't know what was going on. The government is very secretive. They put those barges in at night. The general anti-war movement was carried on campuses, college campuses, and by what people thought, the hippies. So we felt we were some highly respected housewives. We were very middle class. We had 14 children between the 4 of us, and our husbands all were in very good positions, typical middle class. So we decided that we could make an impact on the general population, and it really worked. We did get arrested. We were taken to jail. We were handcuffed. We had to get disinfected. And finally, in the afternoon, when we had a special arraignment, we were taken to the court looking just horrendous, and that really was in all the papers, and it made a tremendous impression. And then we had this trial. The trial lasted 5 days. I used as my defense the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal, where that people were told, when you know something is wrong, you cannot be silent. You cannot say, I only followed orders. You must do something. And that's why I did it. And, we did get 90 days in jail suspended. We never had to serve it any day. But nevertheless, what we really wanted to do, it became news all over the country, from coast to coast. And as I said, it is still there. And then Pete Seeger took the press release, what I gave after sentencing, and what is almost verbatim what the song says. And Pete Seeger asked my permission to put it in song, and it became then a record. And it's newly released. But we really believe that from then on, the anti-war war movement really took off, we were invited in every place. Even the Rotaries invited us to speak to them.
Lisa Kavalaj, as you listen to the revelations about the former Nebraska Senator Bob Kerrey, what is your response? Do you think he's guilty of war crimes?
Well, I do believe that the people who sent him, can either just think that we are all responsible, that he should have said no. Yes, this is one thing, what I really felt when I did my protest. On the other hand, I know those people were sent over, and we heard all this stuff about the free fire zone and the incredible danger they were in and so on and so forth. And I think the people who sent those people there, Kerry and 50,000 Americans who died, and 800,000 GIs who came back maimed on body and soul, the people who sent those, the McNamara's, the Kissingers, yes, those are people, what I consider the chief criminals. They should be tried first. I very firmly believe that.
Well, I want to thank you, Lisa Kavalaj, for joining us. Lisa Kavalaj, again, a woman from Germany who comes from Nuremberg and who tried to stop a shipment of napalm to Vietnam, on whom the Pete Seeger song, My Name is Lisa Kavalaj, is based. And we're going to go now to that issue of the people, the architects who sent the soldiers to Vietnam, as we are joined by Christopher Hitchens. His latest book is called The Trial of Henry Kissinger. Christopher Hitchens writes for Vanity Fair and The Nation magazine. Among the earlier books he's written, The Missionary Position, No One Left to Lie to, and Unacknowledged Legislation. Again, the latest book, The Trial of Henry Kissinger. And as you listen to Lisa Kavalaj and you complete your investigation of Henry Kissinger, what are your thoughts about war crimes?
Well, I must say, it was so wonderful listening to her, and the pluck on the one hand and the common sense on the other, and also the refusal to take refuge in euphemism or in excuses and say, well, there's nothing anyone can do, or it's all too complicated. Some things actually, though they are complex, needn't be confusing, and there's no need to add additional confusion. And, well, I'm very grateful to her for introducing the name Henry Kissinger, because that's the name on my lips at the moment as these things come up. Let's just take the example of Bob Kerrey, who's the president of the school where I teach part-time, among other things. What he and his men did in that village that night was part of a thing called Operation Speedy Express, which was ordered from on high by Henry Kissinger, was National Security Advisor at the time. It was an attempt basically to cleanse the Mekong Delta. And Kevin Buckley of Newsweek wrote a brilliant series of pieces about it at the time, in real time, saying, look, the body count claims for this sweep of the Delta are enormous. Thousands and I have a chunk about this in my book. Thousands and thousands of people, more than had been claimed originally as having been Viet Cong to begin with. Huge mounds of bodies. But, he said, captured weapons seem to be almost none. Strange. How can this be? I mean, that's how he got onto it. And after a bit, the figures began to make sense and to, so to speak, add up or not add up. And it became clear that what was going on was a war of extermination against the civilian population. And you'll note that the citation for Bob Kerrey's Bronze Star for that operation says, it's in a sort of horrible little code. It says 21 VC KIA BC, which translates as 21 Viet Cong killed in action, brackets, body count, that's the BC. That's what he got the Bronze Star for. So, but he was, it is true to say he was acting under orders. I mean, that is not in his case just an excuse, and in his answer to your question, I believe in part he's saying he doesn't want to shift responsibility from himself to anyone else. But it would be true to say that he was under orders, as were all of the fighters in that campaign. Now, the person who was responsible for that is currently, an honored guest on the Society pages and has a column in the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post, and is a consultant to to Nightline and people like that, and is thought of as an independent expert on foreign policy. But you cannot go near the arguments about the destruction of Indochina, the ramifications of the Pinochet case, the horrific disclosures in East Timor, the likelihood, a very strong likelihood of another war breaking out in Cyprus, the terrible situation still in Bangladesh where war crimes and atrocity trials are taking place at the moment. You can't turn over a body and have a look in any of these areas without finding Henry Kissinger's fingerprints. It's as bad as that. It's a one-man international rolling crime wave, as Nixon's understudy and toady, that went on for years and was not stopped and has never been punished, and as a result of which we have to all the time find ourselves stuttering and barking and trying to think of intelligent ways to talk about things like the Kerry case.
Michael Scharf is on the phone with us. He's a professor of law at the New England School of Law. He was a State Department official responsible for war crimes issues under the first Bush administration. He also served as a consultant to the International Criminal Tribunals in Rwanda and Yugoslavia. Do you think that Henry Kissinger should be put on trial for war crimes, crimes against humanity?
Well, let's begin focusing on the Bob Kerry issue and then go to the broader issue of Henry Kissinger. What's unusual about the Bob Kerry issue is that he has made some very strange public statements in the last couple of weeks about this. One is he has admitted that he took part in an atrocity, but said that that didn't mean that he was legally culpable. That's weird because atrocity is just layman terms for war crime, just like ethnic cleansing is layman terms for genocide or crimes against humanity. So if his lawyer was there when he made that statement, I'm sure he would have been turning green. The second thing he said was that he was not educated, nor were his troops, about what were war crimes. They weren't told what they could and they could not do. They were just sent in to do this operation. And that also is inconsistent with what was proven very well in the Lieutenant Calley case. And that is that our troops were told what was a war crime, and they knew that they had a duty not to obey illegal orders. And in the Lieutenant Calley case in particular, they found that you could not claim that an order to kill an innocent baby who was unarmed and obviously not in any way, shape, or form a combatant was an illegal order, and it was clearly and manifestly illegal, and so his failure to disobey that order got him in legal trouble, and he had to go to jail for several years. Now, if that is applied to Kerry, and if the facts are as what have been claimed, Kerry may be facing some real problems. Now, looking at the broader picture of Henry Kissinger, you know, the Vietnam War was a flawed war, and it's something that for 30 years we've all regretted. But one of the problems with the war is that the North Vietnamese, which were the combatants, and the Viet Cong and their supporters, they didn't wear distinctive uniforms, which is one of the requirements to be protected and to have special status under the Geneva Conventions. And so, therefore, when U.S. troops were going into these hot zones and they were taking enemy fire, and it was in the middle of the night, and their job was to try to clear out the enemy, there were a lot of civilian casualties. Those under the Geneva Conventions would be acceptable collateral damage, especially since the North Vietnamese were not wearing these distinctive uniforms, and so it wasn't clear who was and who was not the enemy. It does become clear when you talk about killing little infants, but even teenagers were known to lob hand grenades and to be snipers in this war, and so there were a lot of young people and very old people who were probably innocent civilians that were casualties of the war because of the way this war was fought.
I have to say, I think that that's rather grotesque.
Christopher Hitchens.
Most of the damage inflicted on civilians in Vietnam was by means of aerial bombardment. Now, it's true, that doesn't really, in other words, go to Professor Scharf's bizarre allegation that the Vietnamese are sneaky types who kind of, in their own country, by the way, and in the villages where they live and are born, don't have the courage to sort of get a proper military uniform on, and thus have to take anything that's coming to them. I'm reeling actually from hearing that. Let me kind of compose myself. Telford Taylor, who was the chief U.S. military prosecutor at Nuremberg, wrote a wonderful book which I have accepted almost to the point of plagiarism in my own book because it's so powerful, saying that look, by the standards that we insisted upon for the trial of the Nazi war criminals and also for the Japanese Imperial General Staff, we are in danger of putting ourselves in the dock because of the mass destruction of society from the air by bombardment. This is not the picture that people like to summon up of an American soldier somehow caught in a firefight, perhaps in the dark, shooting back and then finding to his horror that he's hurt some innocent people. This was a systematic business, as I was also saying about Operation Speedy Express, which was also a ground operation. And it considered civilians the enemy. That's a political point, because they were, after all, they were fighting a civilian insurgency. But it treated everyone as if they were a potential cadaver. And that's criminal by any standard. And look, you don't have to tell, under a uniform code of military justice, somebody, by the way, bear in mind it's illegal to shoot a baby. Quite a lot of people know that without being told. And I think the standard we should try and uphold here is that of someone now alas dead, who was a friend of mine, Ron Ridenhour, who got wind, he was a Texan grunt, GI, got wind of what had happened at My Lai and interviewed fellow soldiers and brought evidence together and tried to get the legal officers of the armed forces interested in a prosecution. Colin Powell actually was one of those who told him to get lost and continued to cover up the My Lai episode, so he finally went to the press, but no one had to tell him what was right and what was wrong.
Yeah, let me respond to that. You've heard the old expression, all's fair in love and war. Obviously, that's not true for war, because the Geneva Conventions specify what is and what is not allowed in war. But these rules in war can't be at such a high standard that it's impossible to fight a conflict. And so, therefore, they don't prohibit everything in war. In fact, there is a giant loophole, and that is that certain things can be justified by military necessity. What they do prohibit is purposely targeting civilians as civilians or committing acts of torture against civilians. But if you look at Telford Taylor's book, and I'm looking at the particular pages that you're citing now, what he's focusing on is the bombing of civilian areas suspected of harboring guerrillas. And in fact, that would not be an indictable offense under the Geneva Conventions, because if there was evidence that these were areas that there were combatants using as headquarters, that these were areas the combatants were using as a launching ground, then these would have been legitimate targets under the laws of war. Now, morally, what happened in Vietnam is regrettable. It's reprehensible. I was myself very much an opponent of Vietnam and the way that war was fought. But when you talk about the legal argument against Henry Kissinger and against our policy, it's not that easy a case to make.
Well, I'll concede this much. There is a problem also under the Nuremberg standards with aerial bombardment, because partly, I'm afraid, for cynical reasons, because the Allies had conducted so much aerial bombardment themselves. That isn't specifically charged or nominated as a war crime in the Nuremberg Bill of Indictment. And as a result, there are some shady areas, I grant you, on this point. But however, if, for example, the bombing is conducted by B-52s, which fly too high to be seen from the ground, and carry enormous payloads, which is, I believe, the origin of the term carpet bombing. They lay down a sort of horrific carpet of high explosive from high up. They can't be heard when they're on their way. No one has the chance to take cover. There's no possibility of an air raid warning. You can't tell civilians, we don't like this area, we think the enemy's there, you better get out of the way. None of that. You just devastate the entire society and ecology. Well, I think you have crossed a Geneva Convention line there. In fact, I think you've crossed it very explicitly.
Now, Christopher, you're not saying, are you, that Henry Kissinger designed the strategy of carpet bombing, that he commanded and ordered the troops to do that? That was not his. Well,
I would say, no, excuse me, no, I say very explicitly and in round terms, and it's been done by other people other than me. I'm not the finder of fact in this matter. He very intimately and personally supervised the bombardment of Cambodia in something that's hardly even proper to call a war, since Congress didn't even know about it, let alone have the chance to declare it.
We have to break for stations to identify themselves. When we come back, we'll not only look at Vietnam, but places like Chile and Henry Kissinger's culpability there, and also talk about, well, Christopher Hitchens, if you know what Henry Kissinger's reaction to the possibility of being taken like Pinochet if he were to leave the country. We did try to get Henry Kissinger on, or someone from Kissinger Associates, but they did not get back to us. You are listening to Democracy Now! Our guest, Christopher Hitchens. His book is The Trial of Henry Kissinger, and Michael Scharf, professor of law at New England School of Law and an expert on the issue of war crimes. Stay with us. You're listening to Democracy Now!, Free Speech Radio. I'm Amy Goodman. Our guests are Christopher Hitchens in the studio. His book is called The Trial of Henry Kissinger. And Michael Scharf, professor of law at New England School of Law. He was the official within the Bush State Department, that's George I, responsible for war crimes issues, and has also served as a consultant on the International Criminal Tribunals in Rwanda and Yugoslavia. With the detention of Augusto Pinochet, intense pressure for Slobodan Milosevic, most recently just yesterday, George Bush II calling on Kostunica, the Yugoslav president, to extradite Milosevic to The Hague. The possibility of international law acting against tyrants around the world is emerging as a reality. And today we're looking again at Henry Kissinger. Christopher Hitchens, the response of Henry Kissinger to your call for his trial. Again, we did ask for him or one of his associates to be on from Kissinger Associates. They ultimately did get back to us and said no.
I haven't been able to get anyone much from their side to come out to play on this. I mean, I imagine that if I was Kissinger, I would think, well, I got away with the crimes, so I'll probably get away, and most of them were conducted in the plain view, so I'll probably get away with somebody writing about them. And that would, actually, that's quite a shrewd bet on his part, except that the climate has somewhat changed. With the arrest of Pinochet particularly, two things have happened to condition the climate in which these things are discussed normally. One, universal jurisdiction has become much more the rule than the exception now. More and more countries are empowering their courts to consider those wanted for crimes against humanity as common enemies of the human race to be arrested and tried wherever they can be found. And there are a number of important precedents about this since Pinochet's arrest. I think the most important one was an Argentine death squad type who was picked up in Mexico. Instead of being returned to Argentina, he was sent to answer a warrant in Spain, which Mexico had never done before, third-party extradition. That's the first thing, is universal jurisdiction. There are very few places for people to hide anymore, and Henry Kissinger knows it, and I know takes legal advice about where and when he travels now, which gives me a slight little holiday in my heart, I must say.
What do you mean, takes advice?
Well, he consults lawyers. He got very alarmed, and I have a tape in my book of how alarmed he was. He's talking to his publisher, Michael Korda, on the day that the New York Times published the very, very highly embarrassing disclosures of United States government complicity with Pinochet's death squad operation, with Operation Condor, the internationalization of the death squad principle through the Chilean, Argentine, Paraguayan, Uruguayan, and Brazilian secret police to track down dissidents hemispherically and kill them, murder them. One of the most celebrated ones, of course, being right down in Washington, D.C. During the rush hour, the car bombing of Orlando Letelier. The second important thing about the new climate, the post-Pinochet climate, is this. The defense that such a person can make if arrested, that I did it because I was in government at the time, it's known as sovereign immunity, has been struck down by the British House of Lords. And that precedent for the moment, I think, would hold in a lot of cases. It's much, much harder now to say, well, all right, I was responsible for this or that action of torture or kidnap or disappearance, but I was the head of the government, so that's okay. You
speak specifically about a man that Henry Kissinger was directly implicated in killing in Chile.
Yes. Now, here's the case. You don't need, in my opinion, any new law for this. There's no need to have anything fancy about international war crimes or crimes against humanity or the Geneva Convention or anything. It's the same as the original prohibition against murder. Henry Kissinger sat in a room and decided to remove from the scene General René Schneider, who was the constitutionally minded conservative officer who headed the Chilean General Staff at the time. He was the principal obstacle to a coup to overthrow the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende. So it was decided to whack him, basically, to have him taken out.
Henry Kissinger was National Security Advisor under Nixon at the time.
National Security Advisor. Chile was a country with which the United States was not at war, was a democracy, with which we had diplomatic relations as far as the ambassador to and from Chile knew. good trade relations, excellent history of bilateral friendship, and they decide we want to have a coup in this country because there are some powerful interests, influential with Nixon, who didn't like the outcome of the Chilean election. The obstacle to a coup is General Schneider. Very well, Schneider goes, and he went. They killed him. And we now know, thanks to Congressman Hinch's investigations, but this took a long time to come out, that even after the murder was committed, another sum of money was paid after money had been paid beforehand and guns donated to the gang that committed this revolting crime. Money was paid to them afterwards. So all the arguments that there used to be about, well, maybe they weren't really trying to kill him, or they were only trying to kidnap him or frighten him and so on, it's all void now. We don't need to hear any more of that euphemism or subject changing. They paid off the killers after they'd done the deal.
And how do you know Kissinger was in the room in the discussion?
Well, because I have all the memos that he sent to Chile, urging them to keep up their efforts, saying, here are the guns, saying, here's some more money. And it's taken a long time in Washington, but through the Freedom of Information Act and the efforts of some excellent people like the National Security Archive, we can now say it's a lay-down case. I mean, we know every stage by which this outrage to democracy was conducted, but also by which what I would call the common crime of murder was committed, suborned, solicited, armed, paid for, and covered up.
Professor Michael Scharf, your response.
Supporting the facts, even if you look at your book and what you've said, which I think you were much more careful in your analysis than you're being today, there is nothing in your book or in the cables that you cite that were released in January 1999 that indicate that Kissinger ordered the death of General Snyder, that he gave weapons specifically for the killing of that general. What you have proven, I think, is that he said to the Pinochet regime that the U.S. is sympathetic to what Pinochet is trying to do in terms of trying to deal with these insurgents and these elements of his society that are political opponents of his regime, and that they approved of their general methods. But you haven't proven in any way a conspiracy or aiding and abetting in a criminal manner. And really what you've done is made the same case, I think, that could be made against Jim Baker in Yugoslavia. Jim Baker told Milosevic, look, do whatever you can to keep Yugoslavia from breaking up. We don't want to see another dissolution. And then once the Yugoslav forces started engaging in ethnic cleansing, Jim Baker said, we don't have a dog in that fight. And that also was seen as given a green light to proceed with the same kinds of atrocities that you argue Kissinger was giving a green light to proceed with in Chile. And so the case against Kissinger is no more than the case against Jim Baker.
Excuse me, Professor. I do not think you will find that Jim Baker, of whom I was not a fan, I would say he was a problem for the administration you served rather than for me. But I don't think you will find that Jim Baker was involved in shipping weapons, money, political encouragement, and cover to the death squads that Mr. Milosevic was employing. I don't think you will make that allegation against him, will you?
Well,
if so, I must say I'm very surprised to find you serving. I'm very surprised to find you serving in that State Department if you make that allegation.
You know, that Jim Baker certainly was partly responsible for the arming up of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and again, you know, April Gillespie, the ambassador, the spokesperson.
Yes, but this just isn't comparing like with like. Of course, Jim Baker was a morally null person. You must know that better than most people, having worked in his State Department. This is not the same. This is not the same as sitting in a room and deciding that a constitutional officer in a neighboring democracy, I stress, an ally of the United States with which it has formal diplomatic relations and is not at war, should be removed by force. Okay? It's not, none of the things you mentioned come up to anything like that standard. I think you're simply trying to, I'm sorry, I think you're simply trying to obfuscate.
Finishing a thought you said earlier about Kissinger sitting in a room with Michael Korda, his publisher, when these allegations came out of the U.S. complicity with the overthrow of Allende and the deaths of thousands of people. What did Kissinger actually say? You have a tape recording of it?
I have. What I have is the tape of Michael Korda trying to reassure him that it may not be as bad as he thinks, and that perhaps there's no issue of jurisdiction.
On the issue of Timor, Kissinger's complicity.
On the issue of Timor, the issue, well, here I think the crucial thing is probably the Genocide Convention, but there would be two other laws that were important here. Kissinger sat in the room. I keep saying in the room, but he really is true. He likes to do this hands-on. I almost think he has a relish for this sort of thing at the hands-on stage. He was in the room, so was President Ford, incidentally, with the Indonesian General Scharf, the military dictatorship of Indonesia of the time, on the day that the invasion of East Timor was, so to speak, inaugurated. It had been in preparation for some time. Everyone knew that it might occur, but that it did occur is due to the fact that Henry Kissinger approved of it in advance. Now, three laws, I think, were broken by the Indonesian incursion or invasion, annexation of East Timor. One, it was a Portuguese territory. Portugal was responsible to the United Nations for shepherding it to independence and, with luck, to democracy. So it's a gross violation of international law. It was as simple as that. They just tried to annex by force someone else's territory. Second, it was a violation of American law. The American Foreign Assistance Act forbids the use of those weapons for any purpose except external self-defense. And in the result, it was a gross violation of the Genocide Convention, because it has been shown repeatedly that East Timor was subjugated by means of mass extermination by Indonesian soldiers, and also the use of weapons such as food denial on a grand scale. Well, I know I'm not telling you anything you don't know, Amy, because you've been there, but Kissinger is responsible very, very, I say again, personally, very intimately at every stage of that horrific chain of events, and has lied about it in the most grandiose yet pathetic way, and I'm able to expose all of his lies in the relevant chapter as well.
Michael Scharf, with these different cases, do you think there's enough evidence would be for a grand jury to indict, even if you don't believe in conviction?
No grand jury in the United States would indict, and even in most countries of the world, I don't think they would. There's no evidence that Kissinger ordered or directly participated in these crimes. And the universal jurisdiction that Christopher Hitchens is talking about has been applied in foreign countries against the Nazi leaders who took part in the Holocaust, the Yugoslavia architects of ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, the Rwanda Hutu leaders who were responsible for the '94 genocide, and then the Chile president who specifically ordered the assassination and torture of the opponents of his regime. They have not been applied to people like Henry Kissinger, who were foreign ministers, who may have taken part in broad foreign policy issues, who may have been in the room when some of these things were discussed. Being in the room is not the same thing as being in the dock. And although he is morally culpable, this doesn't rise to the level of criminal culpability under universal jurisdiction.
Christopher Hitchens, your final statement.
Well, I don't think that the moral, the legal, the criminal, and the political have been very well distinguished in my opponent's closing remarks. I'll just repeat that. Henry Kissinger knowingly ordered and concealed from Congress and supervised himself the mass destruction of civilian society in Cambodia. Henry Kissinger, also without congressional authorization, ordered the removal of a democratic general in a democratic country who formed the obstacle to plans for a fascist coup, had him whacked out, had him assassinated. Henry Kissinger approved in advance and subsequently helped arm, after the genocide had begun, the mass murder of the people of East Timor. If anyone thinks these are moral objections only, they are really saying, which is a noise we're hearing increasingly now from the right wing in Washington, that a war crime isn't a war crime if it's committed by an American. This is not even a double standard, right? It's a parody of what international justice is and ought to be, and is becoming, I might add, because the net is tightening around people like Kissinger now, and he knows it.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you both for being with us. Again, Christopher Hitchens, his book is The Trial of Henry Kissinger. Christopher Hitchens, a longtime reporter and columnist for Vanity Fair, The Nation, and has written a number of other books as well. Michael Scharf, professor of law at the New England School of Law. Scharf was the State Department official responsible for war crimes issues under the first George Bush administration. Also served as consultant to the International Criminal Tribunals in Rwanda and Yugoslavia. That does it for the program. If you'd like to order a cassette copy, call 1-800-735-0230. If you'd like to email us, you can send your email to mail@democracynow.org. That's mail@democracynow.org. Or you can write to us at Democracy Now!, Pacifica Radio, 120 Wall Street, New York, 1005. Democracy Now!, Pacifica Radio, 120 Wall Street, New York, New York, 1005. And producers of today's show, Chris Abrams and Brad Simpson. Matthew Finch is our engineer sitting in for Anthony Sloan. Errol Maitland, our technical director. And we'll go out with the song we went in with, and that is the song of Lisa Calveledge. From the embattled studios of WBAI, from the studios of the band and the Fired, from the studios of you, our listeners, I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for listening to another edition of Democracy Now!
Must have been asked 100 times where I was, what I did in those years. Hitler ruled our state. I said I was a child, at most a teenager, but that only continued to question